Have you ever wondered what it feels like to stand on the edge of two worlds, one step away from peace and another step closer to war? What if I told you that in a small corner of the Philippines, just a short flight from Taiwan, a man in uniform wakes up every morning knowing that his country may be the very first line of defense if history decides to turn? That man's name is Captain Ramon Dela Cruz. At 47, his hair is peppered with gray, his skin darkened by years of marching under the sun, but his eyes, sharp, steady, searching, carry the weight of stories he has never told. He is not a politician, not a man of speeches. He is a soldier, a father of 3, a husband to Maria, and a son of a fisherman from Batanes. And yet, he finds himself standing inside the biggest forward operating base ever built by the Philippines, so close to Taiwan that on a clear day he swears he can almost see the island's silhouette. The base itself feels unreal. Concrete runways stretch out like veins across the rugged landscape, hangars large enough to swallow passenger planes whole, barracks lined with flags, some carrying the familiar stars and stripes of the United States. This is no ordinary camp. It is a fortress born from urgency, forged by geopolitics, and funded, at least in whispers, by Washington's deep pockets. On his first morning, Ramon walked the perimeter as the sun lifted itself above the Pacific horizon. The sky bled with colors of fire, and for a moment he forgot the reason he was there. He thought of home. He thought of his youngest daughter, Isabel, who cried when he left. He thought of his father, now too old to fish, who once told him that the sea north of Luzon holds both bounty and danger. The sea remembers, his father used to say, and so must we. Then came the micro shock, small but piercing. As Ramon reached the main gate, he saw something strange, an American colonel, a tall man with a square jaw and pale skin, standing quietly by the flagpole. No cameras, no crowd, no formality. Just him, staring at the Philippine flag as it rose slowly in the morning wind. And Ramon swore he saw the man's eyes glisten, not for the stars and stripes, not for his own homeland, but for a flag that wasn't his. It unsettled Ramon. Why would a foreigner shed tears for a country not his own? Was it guilt, respect, or something else entirely? He kept that question to himself, but it marked the beginning of his unease. The truth was, Ramon had never been comfortable with the idea of Americans funding their base. He had grown up hearing his grandmother's stories of World War II, of Filipino towns burned to the ground, of young men drafted to fight a war that was never theirs. And now, decades later, here he was, living inside a structure built not only with Philippine sweat, but with American dollars. He asked himself quietly, almost guiltily, was this still ours, or were they slowly planting their roots again? But he could not deny what he saw around him. The technology, the sheer scale, the radar towers humming with invisible waves scanning the skies. This was something the Philippines had never seen before. For the first time in his career, he felt both proud and small. Proud that his nation was no longer ignored. Small because he wondered if this pride was borrowed. Later that evening, he sat on his bunk, flipping through a small Bible his wife had tucked into his bag. A verse caught his eye. "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the children of God." He closed his eyes and whispered a prayer, not for himself, but for the countless unknown lives that could be shaped by this very base. He prayed that it would bring peace, not conflict, that it would protect his children's future, not steal it. And yet, as night fell, and the distant sound of jet engines echoed over the waters, Ramon felt something stir inside him, a realization that this was no longer just about him, or even about his family. This was about his country standing on the world stage, whether it was ready or not. The Philippines, long seen as the underdog, had built a stronghold at the crossroads of Asia, a place that could decide the fate of nations. He looked out the window of his quarters and saw the lights of the runway glowing like a constellation pulled down from the heavens. In that glow, he felt a strange mix of fear and pride. Fear of what storms might come, pride that his small nation had chosen to stand tall. And somewhere in the quiet of that night, with the ocean winds carrying whispers from Taiwan, Ramon made a silent vow. He would guard this place not as a pawn of another power, but as a son of the Philippines. And maybe, just maybe, the world would finally see his people not as followers, but as leaders of their own destiny. Ramon did not sleep well after that first night. The engines came and went like the tide, low to a whisper, then loud enough to rattle the glass, and each time he stirred, he pictured his children's faces. At dawn, he brewed instant coffee in a dented mug and stepped outside, the steam curling against the cool air. He dialed home. Maria answered on the second ring, her voice soft, careful, as if not to wake the house. Isabel had cried again, she said. Their middle son, Mateo, was trying to act brave, but had asked whether the base meant their father would be sent to Taiwan if something happened. The oldest, Paulo, had joked that his father was now the guardian of the North. But even through the joke, Ramon heard the tightness. "Tell them I am safe," he said. "Tell them my work is to keep trouble far away, not to run into it." He listened to the sound of the kettle on their stove, the clink of a ceramic plate, the life he knew like muscle memory. When he hung up, the runway lights were starting to fade, and he felt the old ache of choosing duty over breakfast with his family. He went to the mess hall, a long, echoing room that smelled of coffee, garlic, and jet fuel. The line snaked past a window where a young American airman was trying to ask for rice in halting Tagalog, making the cooks laugh. When Ramon stepped up, the airman nodded with an exaggerated seriousness and said, "Salamat po, sir," like a child copying his teacher. The cooks, two women from Cagayan, handed Ramon a plate with longanisa and a fried egg, then slid an extra banana to the airman with a conspiratorial wink. The airman turned and said, "Nakakahiya, I do not deserve," the word mangled into a warm apology. "Where did you learn that?" Ramon asked. "Oklahoma," the airman said. "From the Filipino nurses at my church. They taught me po and ate and tito, and how to make lumpia that doesn't fall apart. It was nothing grand, just a small exchange at breakfast, but it tugged loose one knot in Ramon's chest. He had expected a wall. Instead, over rice and laughter, there were bridges. Later that day, the base chapel held a noon prayer. The chapel was new but modest, simple wooden pews and a cross that seemed too large for the narrow wall behind the altar. The chaplain, a Filipino in his 50s with gray around the temples, spoke about "Blessed are the peacemakers" in a voice that carried without effort. In the back row sat a scattering of uniforms, some with patches he had never seen before, some with familiar tricolor crests. Beside him, an American sergeant bowed his head with an intensity that made the veins in his neck stand out. As the prayer ended, the chaplain asked everyone to pass the peace. Ramon shook hands with a pilot from Zambales, a mechanic from Ilocos, and then the American sergeant, who looked him in the eye and said, "For your children and mine." The words lodged in Ramon's throat. He nodded, unable to speak for a beat, stunned by the way a stranger had named the very thing he carried like a stone. In the afternoon, he was assigned to inspect a stretch of perimeter fence that bordered a low bluff above the sea. The wind was strong there, the kind that bent tall grass into one direction and kept it there long after the gusts passed. Down below, he saw a small banca nosing along the rocks, a lantern hanging from its bow, even though it was still daylight, the habit of men who rise before light and return after dark. The fisherman cut his engine when he spotted Ramon and raised a hand. Ramon raised his back, then climbed down the path that soldiers had stamped into the slope. The fisherman introduced himself as Nardo from a barangay just down the coast. He asked if the new base would chase them farther out. "My father fished here," he said. His voice had no anger, just a quiet question, a ledger kept in the pocket of a man who knows his days by tides. Ramon said the safety zones were marked, that patrols would guide them, that the sea was not closed. Mang Nardo nodded slowly. He poured coffee from a thermos into the plastic cap and offered it. They stood shoulder to shoulder, looking north, the waves kneading the rocks below them. "Sometimes," the fisherman said, "we see lights at night, not ours, not yours. Sometimes big ships that do not answer when we call." "The sea remembers," he added, as if it were a greeting to an old truth. Ramon felt the words strike something buried deep and ring. There were small surprises that week, each one a piece of a puzzle he had thought he already knew. He found a card tacked to the corkboard in the barracks, scrawled handwriting thanking the base clinic for treating a child from the nearby village who had broken her arm. He heard that a logistics sergeant had organized donations to fix the roof of a barangay chapel after a storm, not as a program or a press release, just as an act done on a Sunday afternoon with 8 pairs of hands and a borrowed ladder. On the tarmac, he watched a joint drill unfold, not the roaring combat exercise he had expected, but a humanitarian evacuation rehearsal. Rows of cots, water tanks, a helicopter whose rotors he had always associated with fear, now lowered gently over a field tent marked with a red cross. He saw a lieutenant from the Air Force kneel to speak to a group of local high school students during a tour, answering their questions with a patience that surprised him. "Yes, the towers listen to the sky," the lieutenant said, "but they also watch clouds for incoming storms. Information for defense, yes, but also for fishermen and farmers." The American colonel from the flagpole introduced himself 2 days later. He found Ramon near the hangar, where the smell of fuel was strongest and the noise seemed to bounce from concrete to bone. The colonel's name was Cole. He asked if the quarters were comfortable, if the schedule was reasonable. His Tagalog was non-existent, but his courtesy felt unforced. After a few minutes of practical questions, Cole hesitated, and then said he had a son studying in Tokyo, not far in miles from where they stood, but another world in the way maps lie about distance. He asked if Ramon had children. 3, Ramon said, trying to keep his voice even. The colonel nodded and stared past the runway toward a line where sky met sea. He said, "I am not here to plant any flag. I am here to make sure your children do not learn the taste of fear." It was a polished sentence, the kind men like him are trained to say. But the way he lingered on the last word made it feel less like a line and more like a vow pressed through clenched teeth. Ramon did not answer. He simply held the man's gaze until the colonel dipped his head and excused himself. In the quiet moments between drills, Ramon found himself drawn to the small chapel again. In the late afternoon, as the heat softened and a thin haze hung over the runway, he sat in the back pew and opened the Bible Maria had tucked into his bag. He traced her handwriting on the inside cover. "Come home safe. Come home proud." He thought about how pride and safety rarely shared a bed. He remembered his grandmother's stories, the ones laced with smoke and hunger and courage. He had always thought of those stories as a warning not to trust easy alliances. Now, listening to the hum of a generator outside and the distant laughter from the mess hall, he wondered whether alliances could also be a way to carry storms together, each hand steadying the other. That night the base was strangely still. The jets had gone quiet, the wind had settled, and the sea seemed to hold its breath. Ramon went outside without knowing why, and walked until the chapel bell was only a shadow behind him. Down the slope, fishermen's lanterns blinked on, one by one, scattered across the water like a rosary laid softly on a blue velvet cloth. From the chapel behind him, someone began to sing a hymn, a voice so thin he thought at first it was the wind. Ama namin, it rose and fell, and somewhere across the fence an American voice joined in, not with words, but with a hum that found the tune and followed it. The engines, the drills, the speeches, all receded, and for a long breath there were only lanterns and a hymn and an old fisherman's sentence echoing through his chest. The sea remembers. He stood there for a long time. He let the quiet enter him, let it find the places fear had hardened and softened them. This, he realized, was the first time since he arrived that he had felt something like peace. Not the peace of ignorance or distance, but the peace of a man who understands his place on the map and accepts the weight of it. He was not a pawn. He was not a spectator. He was a son of an island that had always faced the wind, and now that wind had brought the world to their shore. He breathed in the salt and the song and the glow of those distant lights, and felt something shift. If he must stand at the edge of two worlds, he would do it with both feet on his own soil, eyes open, heart steady, and hands ready to build even as he guarded. The days began to blur into drills, briefings, and quiet nights staring at the dark outline of the sea. Ramon had grown used to the rhythm, but beneath the routine, a storm gathered in him. He felt it when he watched the fishermen cast their nets just outside the restricted zone, when he heard Maria's voice tremble during calls, when he saw the children of nearby villages wave at the convoys with both awe and unease. One evening, a sudden alert ripped through the base. Sirens wailed, boots pounded the concrete, and Ramon's heart jolted into his throat. He grabbed his gear and ran with his men toward the northern watchtower. The horizon glowed faintly, not fire, but light bouncing off the steel hull of something enormous. Through the binoculars, he saw it. A warship, its flag foreign, its presence unannounced. It moved slowly, defiantly, as if testing how close it could come before someone told it no. The young private beside him whispered, "Sir, is this the beginning?" Ramon's throat tightened. He remembered his father's words. The sea remembers. This was not the first time outsiders had come uninvited, but now he was no longer a fisherman's son watching from shore. He was the man expected to stand tall while the world pressed closer. He steadied his voice and told the private, "Not tonight. But we must be ready." The ship eventually veered away, leaving only a restless silence behind. But in that silence, Ramon felt the weight of the base, the purpose of its existence. It was no longer an abstract project whispered in Manila or debated on news channels. It was a shield, fragile but firm, standing between his children's laughter and a future that could burn. That night, unable to sleep, he walked back down to the bluff where he had once shared coffee with Mang Nardo. The fisherman was there again, lantern swinging in the wind. He asked Ramon what the sirens had meant. Ramon hesitated, then admitted the truth. The sea was no longer just water and fish. It was a frontier, a contested line where nations measured each other's pride. Mang Nardo listened, eyes fixed on the horizon, then said softly, "The sea has always been ours, but now it seems the world wants a peace." Ramon felt the sting of those words. He looked at the waves and thought of the base behind him, its runways, its radars, its foreign funding. Was this fortress truly theirs? Or was it a stage where bigger players would act out their power while his people paid the price? And yet, as he stood there, a different thought rose within him. What if this was not about being pawns, but about refusing to be ignored. For too long, the Philippines had been spoken of as small, fragile, dependent. But here, at this edge of the sea, the world's eyes were fixed on them. Not because they were weak, but because their soil mattered, their waters mattered, their people mattered. The realization struck him like a tide. This was not just a base, it was a statement, a reminder that the Philippines, so often underestimated, held a place so vital that giants could not move without considering it. The next morning, Ramon gathered his unit. He looked at their faces, young, tired, determined, and spoke not as their captain, but as their brother. "We are not here just to guard steel and concrete," he said. "We are here to guard the future of our families, our villages, our faith. This base is not the property of any foreign flag. It is ours. Every brick, every runway light, every watchtower, it stands on our land, under our sky, beside our sea, and it will be remembered as Filipino." The men stood straighter, shoulders squared. A silence hung, not heavy but electric. One of them crossed himself, another whispered, "Amen." For the first time, Ramon felt the base breathe, not as a machine of war, but as a heartbeat of resolve. That evening, as the sun sank into the water, he returned once more to the chapel. The light poured through the windows, casting long shadows that reached across the floor. He knelt and prayed, not for victory, but for wisdom, not for power, but for peace. He asked that his children would grow in a Philippines that could stand tall without losing its soul. When he rose, he saw Colonel Cole standing near the back, watching quietly. The American did not speak, only placed his hand over his chest in a gesture of respect. For the first time, Ramon did not feel suspicion at his presence. Instead, he felt something else, perhaps the beginning of trust, fragile but real. As he stepped outside, the night air wrapped around him. He looked at the stars, countless and eternal, and felt a clarity he had never known. He was no longer torn between fear and pride. He understood now, to be Filipino was to carry both, to guard fiercely while hoping endlessly, to bend like bamboo but never break. And in that moment, standing between the base and the sea, Captain Ramon Dela Cruz knew that history might one day write of battles, alliances, and strategies. But for him, for his family, and for his people, this story was about something far deeper, the awakening of a nation that had long been underestimated, now standing unshaken at the edge of the storm. The first time Maria visited the base, Ramon felt more nervous than he had on any patrol. She arrived with their 3 children in a borrowed van, dust rising behind the tires as it rolled past the security checkpoint. Isabel leapt out first, her school shoes scuffing against the gravel, her arms flung wide as if to prove she could still hold him the way she had when she was small. Paulo followed with teenage awkwardness, his shoulders broadening, but his eyes searching for his father's approval. Mateo stayed close to Maria, clutching her hand, pretending not to be afraid. Ramon had expected pride, maybe even awe, when they saw the base. Instead, he caught Maria's face as she looked around at the towering hangars, the humming radars, the endless expanse of runway. Her brows drew tight. "It feels too big," she said softly, almost to herself. He wanted to tell her it was all for safety, for peace, but the words caught in his throat. He led them through the barracks, introduced them to his men, showed them the chapel where he prayed. Isabel ran her fingers across the wooden pews, whispering a childish prayer of her own. Paulo asked endless questions about the jets, the ships, the equipment. Mateo stayed quiet, eyes darting from soldier to soldier, until he finally tugged at his father's sleeve. "Papa," he whispered, "if war comes, will you be the first one they shoot?" The question cut him deeper than any bullet could. He knelt, placing both hands on Mateo's shoulders. "Listen to me," he said. "I am here so that war does not reach you. I am here to make sure you can grow without fear." The boy nodded but did not smile. Children know when promises are too heavy. Later they stood together at the bluff overlooking the sea. Mariah held her shawl tight against the wind, watching the horizon. "Do you trust them?" she asked suddenly. "The Americans." "Their money, their promises." Ramon did not answer right away. He thought of Colonel Cole's hand over his chest in the chapel, of the American airmen struggling to say salamat, of the fisherman's words, "The sea has always been ours." Finally he said, "I do not trust easily, but I trust that we must stand. If we do not, others will decide for us." Maria's eyes glistened. "And what if standing costs you your life? What if it costs our children their father?" Ramon turned to face her fully. "Then they will know that their father stood for them, for this land, for the right to be free. And that is worth more than any fear." They stayed until the sun sank low, the sky painted in streaks of red and gold. The children threw stones into the waves, their laughter carried by the wind. For a moment, Ramon felt both the fragility and the strength of his world. He was not just guarding a base, he was guarding a future that had names, faces, voices. That night, after his family left, he sat alone in the chapel. He replayed Mateo's question, Maria's doubts, Isabel's tiny prayer whispered into the wood of the pew. He wondered if God measured bravery not by the battles men fought, but by the love they carried into those battles. The following morning, the base held a joint drill. Civilians were invited to watch, a display of coordination, power, and readiness. Ramon stood with his men as aircraft roared overhead, as convoys moved in practiced rhythm. His children sat in the stands, their eyes wide, the ground trembling beneath their feet. He glanced at Maria. This time, instead of fear, he saw something else in her gaze. Respect, reluctant but real. After the drill, Paulo came running. "Papa," he said breathlessly, "I didn't know the Philippines could do this." "I thought only America had bases like this." "But this is ours, right?" "Ours?" Ramon placed a hand on his son's shoulder, steady and firm. "Yes, Paulo. Ours. Never forget that." That evening, when the base quieted, Ramon received an unexpected visitor. It was Magnardo, the fisherman, carrying a small bundle wrapped in cloth. He handed it to Ramon. Dried fish, salted and simple. "For your family," he said. Then, after a pause, "For all our families." Ramon thanked him, touched by the gesture. They stood together once again, watching the sea. This time Ramon spoke first. "You were right, Magnardo. The sea remembers, and so must we. But maybe it also teaches. Maybe it tells us that no matter who sails upon it, the shore belongs to us." The fisherman nodded. "The sea gives, the sea takes, but the land is where we plant, where we bury, where we rise. That is what we must hold." That night, Ramon wrote a letter to his children. He told them not about war, nor about politics, but about pride. He told them that the Philippines was small only to those who measured land and wealth, not spirit. He told them that standing tall was not about power, but about dignity, about refusing to bow even when giants circled. He ended with words he hoped they would remember long after he was gone. "You are children of the sea and the soil. Walk with pride, live with faith, and never forget that this land is yours to guard and to love." As he folded the letter, Ramon felt something shift inside him. For the first time, he no longer saw the base as foreign or borrowed. It was not a gift. It was not a burden. It was a crucible, a place where his nation's courage would be tested, refined, and remembered. And as the night deepened, as the lanterns of fishermen dotted the horizon, he felt a peace settle in his chest. He was not afraid of the cost anymore, because the cost, however heavy, was the price of standing tall. Before sunrise, the sky over the base was a slate of quiet gray, the kind of calm that makes every sound sharper. Ramon woke to the crackle of the radio and the clipped voice of the duty officer asking for him by name. There was a distress call off the northern shoals, a small Filipino fishing boat taking on water in choppy seas, its engine dead, its hull scraping against hidden rock. The coordinates put it near the invisible lines that make men argue about maps. A storm front was sweeping in fast from the east. If they waited for the sea to settle, they would be pulling bodies instead of hands. He dressed without thinking, the motions of years. On the tarmac, rotors began to spin, the wind whipping at the sleeves of his jacket. The rescue helicopter was ready, but the pilot warned of low ceilings and a narrow window. On the radar screen, a second mark had appeared, a large vessel tracking close to the distressed boat and refusing to answer hails. No flag on the transponder, no courtesy over the air. It moved like a shadow with a purpose. He found Colonel Cole near the hangar doors, already geared, eyes narrowed at the screen. The American said he could assign a second bird and a medevac crew if Ramon wanted. Ramon felt the old tug of pride and suspicion collide in his chest. He pictured Maria's face, the worry she tried to hide behind strength. He thought of Mang Nardo's words about the sea and the shore. Then he answered in a voice that surprised him with its steadiness. "We will take the lead. Your team can back us up. Our rescue. Our call." Cole held his gaze for a breath and nodded once. "Understood, Captain." They lifted into the gray. The coastline slid beneath them, a jagged ribbon, waves hammering the rocks with white fists. Rain began in needles. The pilot called out altitudes, headings, gust speeds, his voice a metronome beating back panic. Beside Ramon, a young crewman secured the harness and checked the winch 3 times, lips moving in a prayer he did not try to hide. Through the windshield, the sea turned darker, a field of shifting iron plates. A flash of color appeared at the edge of the swells, then vanished, then appeared again. A blue hull, a lantern strung to the bow even in daylight, the stubborn signature of men who fish whether the sky likes it or not. On the radio, a thin voice broke in, breathless and wet. "This is San Lorenzo, engine failure. We are 6 souls on board." The wind tore at the words. A second voice followed, firmer and closer, announcing itself in a language Ramon understood, but with a tone he did not. It advised the fishing boat to cut its anchor and drift southwest for boarding. It did not say by whom. Ramon leaned into his microphone. "San Lorenzo, this is Captain Dela Cruz of the Philippine base. Hold position. We are overhead. We are lowering a rescue line. Do not cut your anchor." The shadow vessel answered at last, its voice smooth as glass. "Unidentified aircraft. You are operating in unsafe conditions. Cease interference. Your transmission has been recorded." Ramon did not look at the radar screen. He kept his eyes on the deck below, where a man in a yellow rain jacket was waving a shirt, each arc a plea. He clicked the push to talk and let his voice carry what the map could not. "This is a humanitarian rescue in Philippine waters. We will proceed. Clear the area." The winch screamed. The crewman went down first, a bright speck swinging above a black mouth of water. The helicopter bucked. Twice the line snatched sideways, once so hard the pilot hissed. 2 fishermen were hauled up, shaking, their hands cracked white from the cold. A third man came with a gash on his leg, blood thin and pink in the rain. The fourth refused to leave until the youngest on board was clipped in. The child had the eyes of a boy who knew storms, and yet tears still cut tracks through the salt on his cheeks. When they pulled him into the cabin, he looked straight at Ramon, as if memorizing a face he might one day need to believe in. On the radio, the shadow ship's voice returned, colder now. "You are creating risk. You do not control this zone," Ramon answered without heat. "We control our duty. Stand clear." The last two men came up together, one nearly slipping from the harness before the crewman wrapped him in a bear's embrace and hauled him home. The pilot called fuel and weather and time to base in a single breath that ended the way a swimmer's first gasp ends when he breaks the surface. They turned south. Through the rain, the outline of the other vessel held position for a few heartbeats, then slid back into the gray, the sea swallowing its edges as if nothing had been there at all. On the ground, medics rushed the injured to the clinic. The rescued men stumbled out under their own will, bowing to no one and thanking everyone. One reached for Ramon's hands and would not let go, squeezing once, hard, the way a father does when words are either too many or too few. Ramon felt a tremor in his arms long after the man released him. He looked up and saw, beyond the clinic awning, the cluster of villagers who had hurried to the fence when the sirens rose. Among them were school children, half in uniform, faces tipped upward, and there, beside the gate, a familiar shawl held tight against the wind. Maria's eyes met his. She did not speak. She simply pressed her palm to her heart. By late afternoon, the storm had passed. The sky opened in rinsed blue. In the chapel, a candle burned in thanks, its small flame steady against the draft. Ramon sat alone for a moment and let the silence move through him. He thought of the headline that would bounce around phones and radios by nightfall. The question that had trailed the base since its first slab of concrete was poured. Was it funded by the United States? He knew the practical answers the officials would give, the agreements and programs and acronyms. He was not a spokesman. He was a soldier who had watched a child blink away salt and fear aboard a helicopter that carried both Philippine markings and foreign parts. And here was the truth he had found in the storm. Money might pour concrete. Politics might draw boundaries. But only the people who stand on a line decide what it means. As dusk fell, the base called a short assembly by the flagpole. The rescued crew, patched and bandaged, stood at the front. Mang Nardo arrived late, hat in his hands, eyes bright with a pride that looked like sunlight on wet rock. Colonel Cole kept to the side, his presence quiet, his face unreadable and yet somehow open. Ramon stepped forward, not because he had planned to speak, but because the pressure in his chest would not let him stay still. He said that a base is not a monument to power, it is a promise to the living. He said that every tower and runway must answer to the oldest duties a people know: to guard the weak, to welcome the lost, to steady the ones who tremble. He said that partnerships can help you lift heavier, but only if your back is straight to begin with. He pointed toward the water and called it the oldest road they own. He described how the wind can make men bow and the bamboo bend, and yet both return to their shape when the tempest passes. He did not name adversaries. He named his children. He named the fishermen. He named the students who would one day build ships and write laws and sing hymns under the same sky. When he finished, no one clapped. It was not that kind of moment. The chaplain's voice rose with a prayer, and the crowd murmured it back line by line, like a tide coming in. Afterward, the colonel approached and offered his hand. There was no speech this time, only a simple sentence that felt like a bridge laid carefully between stones. Your lead saved them, Captain. Thank you for letting us follow. Night returned with lanterns on the water, a necklace of lights stretching into the dark. Ramon walked to the bluff one last time. The wind lifted the smell of salt and diesel and wet grass, the scent of his life, ordinary and sacred. He thought of the question that had started his unease when he first arrived. Was this truly theirs? He looked at the runway lights pulsing like a heartbeat, and at the chapel cross gleaming faintly, and at the flag stirring above the fence. He knew his answer at last. This base is a Filipino sentence spoken in a loud world. It is a hand raised not in surrender, but in witness. It is a shelter against storms and a sign to strangers that there are people here who will stand their ground without losing their grace. Let the world debate who paid for steel. The price that matters was written today in courage, in prayer, in the grip of a rescued man, and the gaze of a child who will sleep without nightmares. He turned toward the barracks. Somewhere behind him a fisherman laughed. Somewhere far offshore a ship's horn blew and faded. Above, the first star showed itself, small but sure. Captain Ramon Dela Cruz tucked Maria's letter against his ribs and walked back down the path, a soldier of a nation that had stepped out of the margins and into its own light. He did not feel like an underdog. He felt like a man who had chosen his line and promised to hold it. And that, he knew, is how peace is kept.